Welcome. Today we're going to be looking at adjusting the exposure and contrast for this particular image non-destructively in Photoshop. So there are many different ways to do it, and you might see different tutorials that do this in different ways. This is just normally the way that I do it, using two adjustment layers, one for levels and then one for contrast using a curves. So in order to adjust non-destructively, we will use adjustment layers and layers, so the panel here. So that means you should avoid using the image menu to perform adjustments on your image, because those are destructive adjustments which can, over time and many adjustments to the same image, may degrade the overall quality of your image. Also, in Adobe's best practices, it is recommended that when you're adjusting images that you adjust the highest resolution image, and also preferably an image that is 16-bit. Now this particular image is RGB 8-bit image. It's just been, the resolution has been lowered to make editing quicker and for demonstration purposes. But normally in your window, in your image menu, you should see that this is 16-bit. There's no point in me changing this to 16-bit now, as if I do, I'll be still working with an 8-bit image just in a 16-bit mode. So the image needs to be 16 bits to start out with. So when you're converting your raw file to an image and bringing it into Photoshop, you should remember to choose the 16-bit option. And also Photoshop recommends using either the Adobe RGB or ProPhoto color spaces for image editing. It's always better to use as much data as available to you as possible when editing the image, especially if you're making many edits to it. So let's get started with this edit. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to adjust the overall exposure of this image, because it is quite dark, especially in the shadows. If we look on the histogram over on the right hand side, you can see everything is going on to the left of the histogram, which is where the dark tones are. And if we divide the histogram into two halves, on the right side where the brighter tones are, there's not very much at all. So mainly these small areas here would represent the highlights of the building and where the sun is hitting. So the first thing we can do then is go ahead and do our levels adjustment. So we do that by going to this flyout menu and go to levels. So this is on the layers panel. And then we can just simply drag this slider over. We want to avoid clipping. So clipping is when you overexpose the bright areas so that they no longer have any detail in them. So if I do this, you can see this line starts dragging up against the right hand edge, which means we're clipping the highlights. It means that in those highlight areas there's detail that's disappearing and there's only white, the color white there. So we want to avoid that, so I'll leave that here, and then I want to drag this over here just to bring the midtones in a little bit. So overall that looks quite a bit better. Normally when I make this adjustment, I do overdo it a little bit, just because I know afterwards I'm going to make a contrast adjustment to bring the contrast back a bit. So it does tend to get a bit flat when I make an adjustment like this. So a flat image, you see with the histogram, normally the properties of a flat image where the histogram is that there's a lot of detail in the center and not much on the extreme right and left hand sides. And that's the case here. The image has gone quite flat in terms of tone. So we need to correct that. So before I do that, I'm just going to change the blending properties of this to luminosity in order so it won't badly affect our colors. This tends to desaturate or lower the vibrance of an image, but we'll have a look at that in through another adjustment in a moment. The next adjustment I want to place is one for contrast. So the one for contrast, we're going to do that by making a selection or sorry, not by making a selection, but we're going to do that by making an adjustment for with the curves adjustment. So I'm going to select here from the panel. This is the curves adjustment, and we're going to create 3 points here. So I'm going to create a point here in the shadows and a point here in the highlights, and I'm going to create another point here just to anchor in the midtone area. And just simply what you're doing is with the curves, you've got this point. So if we look at the bar below, with the curves, this represents our shadows. So by dragging this up, we'll darken the image, and by dragging this down, we'll lighten the image, but we only affect the tones in this area. We're not affecting the tones, we're not affecting the shadows. Here we're not affecting the highlights. Okay, so the way I like to display my curves is percentage based. So there's different ways you can display it. Well, there's 2 different ways. So if I go to the flyout menu and go to display curves display options, by default a lot of the time it's set to light 0 to 255. I find that value that quite arbitrary in terms of adjustments, and I like to use the pigment ink, especially since I've done a lot of work also in print. It just makes more sense to use this percentage value. It feels more definitive to me. So with the percentage display option enabled, I choose my first one, and I can change that by, I can mouse down and put my cursor in the output field, and this just gives me a little more control. I can change that to 80 and do the same thing for the highlights into the output field, and then use the down arrow to make those highlights a bit brighter. And you can see what happens to the histogram there if I disable and enable that. It starts pulling apart, which is adding more contrast for us. And again, I can add a luminosity blending mode to that so it won't affect the color. Okay, so now that we've brightened up our image, it does look a little flat in terms of color. So we could do with adding some type of vibrance or saturation to it. So that's what I'll do next. I go to my flyout menu from my layers panel and add another layer adjustment called vibrance. And what you can do here is then, because I've got some people in the image, I don't want it to affect their skin tones too much when I adjust the color. So vibrance is obviously always a good slider for that, because it won't affect skin tones or make skin tones look unnatural as the saturation slider would. So I increase the vibrance, and you can do a small increase to saturation. And I can minimize that. So now we've got our 3 layers. We've got vibrance, we've got our contrast, and we've got our levels. And of course, you can always give these layers names by double clicking on them. So I can call this one color, I can call this one contrast, and I can call the final one exposure. It is also important to remember that layer order matters. Just before I talk about that, let me just change the color one. So I can change this to color, so it only affects our colors and not the tones of the image. So yeah, so layer order matters. So for instance, if I was to put the contrast below exposure, you will see a slight change in the image. So normally the rule I use when I'm making these types of adjustments is that the layer order should be based on how I'm responding to my previous adjustment. So for instance, I made an exposure adjustment which flattened the image. So I responded to that by increasing the contrast, so that therefore that layer goes on top. And then I responded to these adjustments affecting the color or lowering the color vibrance, and I added this final layer on top. So if I was to add this layer on bottom, you might see there's a slight color shift up in the top area, because these layers have to pass through each other, so it can affect the overall look of the image. Finally then, in terms of good housekeeping, it's good to keep your layers in order. So I like to add my layers to groups. So if I want to put these in a group, I highlight them by selecting the first layer, shift holding the shift key and then clicking the last layer, and then you can either go through the layer menu, go to layer and group layers, or use the shortcut Control G or Command G on a Mac, and that will group your layers. And now I have my layers in a group, and they can also be enabled and disabled, so we see what our adjustment looks like before and after. So we've successfully edited the image non-destructively. We preserve detail in our highlights, and we have revealed a nice bit of detail in our shadows now, and based on the histogram, this image is much in a much better place than it was, for instance, when we started. So in this case, once you're finished, you can go ahead and save the file if you want to preserve the layers as a PSD file, or if you want to go ahead and combine the layers and then save it as a JPEG, you can go to Merge Visible and then save it as a JPEG. Okay, thank you for watching.